G'day, Trooper Cody and Steve with one of our Australian light horse history videos, and it's a one in the series Horse Crime. And again, this thing with these videos is I leave it up to you to pick what you think the crime is. So we're going to talk this time about the US Cavalry. So straight away you're thinking of John Wayne, thinking of wild red Indians and wooden forts out on the prairie. But what we're going to talk about actually is the US Cavalry in its demise. So at the end of World War I, 1918, the war ends, the US military has 3 million men enlisted. Of course, some of them are flying and some of them are in the ships. So we've got 1918 and we've got 3 million men enlisted, and the war ends and everybody's broke. So by the 1st of January 1920, the American government has reduced that number of 3 million down to 130,000 enlisted men in the US Army. Quite a drop. The Army, of course, is not happy about this, and they approach Congress to have the Army increased, and they say the Army should be at least 500,000 enlisted men. So they get some congressmen on side, and on the 4th of June 1920, which is exactly 33 years to the day before I was born, just 33 years before I was born, Congress agrees that it will pay for 280 troops to be in the US Army. So what happens of that 280? They agree there'll be roughly 1,000 officers and 16,000 men will go into the US Cavalry mounted on horses. That was 1920. And by 1922, just 2 years later, they had reduced that number by half. Half the officers were gone, half the troops were gone. This is all about the cost of war, depression, there'll never be another war, we can't afford this, we don't really need it, nothing's happening. So by 1927, they finally got the US Cavalry in total up to 120,000. One of the good things they managed to do then is they create the Philippine Scouts. What the Philippine Scouts were meant to be was that was seen in the 20s. Are you listening to me? Can you hear this? In the 20s, American politicians and powers that be knew there was going to be a problem in Southeast Asia. In the 20s, what were they thinking to allow the things that went wrong? But anyway, they decided they were going to create the Philippine Scouts, and it was going to be 25 regiments fully equipped of cavalry to fight any problems that ever occurred in the Southeast Asia, Philippines, Singapore, Burma, in any of those areas. So, by the 1930s, what has happened in the US mainland is the US Cavalry is just about done. They have got no modern equipment. They're still using things left over from the First World War. They are doing nothing but training, 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 and ceremonial activities. They are a shadow of them former selves. You've got to take a minute here. You've got to excuse me. We're in Australia. It's coming up to summer. The flies in this country are unbelievable. So you've got to excuse the Australian salute as I go through this. So a couple of things have happened by the 30s and why the US Cavalry has gone this way is because people are seeing what has been achieved with, up to the 1930s, with mechanisation in the army, tanks and armoured cars and lorries and things like that. And so there is a big push in America to get rid of the horses completely. The other side of the coin is there are officers saying, hang on, there are places a horse can go that a tank can't go, and if only a man can go, how much better that a man on a horse does it? Because you've got to remember, the US Cavalry isn't like Cossacks that do everything on horses with swords. The US Cavalry was a lot like the Australian light horse. They were dismounted for action. It would be a horse handler. The three of the men would go and shoot their guns. So there's this big push to keep the cavalry, and there's this arguing going on. Which should it be? Mechanisation, not mechanisation. While this arguing is going on, a bloke with a funny moustache starts invading other small countries. People don't realise, everyone thinks Hitler was some sort of technological genius. What they don't realise is that, yes, Hitler had tanks and state-of-the-art tanks and armoured cars and could pull heavy weapons, and hence the term blitzkrieg. But what they don't realise is everything that was in the newsreels, everything you ever saw of a blitzkrieg, was tiny by comparison. That most of Hitler's army was on horses, horse-drawn cannons, horse-drawn stores, mounted troops. But no, the blitzkrieg was all that the media were interested in, rushing into Poland, rushing into France. And so what this caused in America is the final nail in the coffin, if you like, that we have got to pursue mechanisation. The horses are gone, finished. And then the day of infamy, Pearl Harbor was attacked. Once Pearl Harbor was attacked, the decision was made, no more horses. We've got to go the mechanisation route. Every cavalry unit is going to become armoured cars, tanks. It's finished. There was one exception, the 26th US Cavalry Regiment, known as the Philippine Scouts. They still existed. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and we have a mere 55 officers with 800 men on horseback in the Philippines. So what happened? How successful was an antiquated cavalry unit against the might of the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia? So what happened is the Japanese landed at Lingayen on the 22nd of December 1941. They were attacked by those Philippine Scouts, 55 officers, about 1,000 men, and the staggering thing is 2 regiments of tanks and 2 regiments of mounted infantry were held up by those mounted troops for 6 hours. 6 hours. It allowed a retreat of stores, equipment, lives, people got away, while the cavalry held up 2 regiments of tanks and 2 regiments of infantry for 6 hours. 2 days go past. It's the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. The Japanese launch a major tank assault on Binalongnan. The 26th Philippine Scouts not only stopped those tanks, they counter-attack and managed to push the Japanese back to a point where the Japanese call up reinforcements. The 26th Scouts stop the Japanese moving at all, taking a step forward until night falls. And as soon as night falls, discretion is the better part of valour, and the 26th then retreat under the darkness. They move to an area which is a channel, if you like, a valley that is going to allow all of the American troops and civilians and anyone that's with them to evacuate through to Bataan. And so by now, the 26th are halved. There's no actual record of how many officers are still alive at this point, simply that there's about 450 of the 1,000 are still alive. And they harass and fight the Japanese and keep the passage open to allow the escape through to Bataan. That's Christmas Eve of 41. What they then do is they retire to Bataan, where they're going to try and make a stand, and that Christmas of 41 is the last activity of the 26th Philippine Scouts on horseback, because this is the part that always gets me upset. After doing all that, horses fighting tanks, they then ate the horses. All of the horses were slaughtered for meat to be eaten. And from that point on until the 9th of April 1942, a good 3 months, the 26th, or what was left of them, continued to fight, harass and harry the Japanese right up until to the surrender, but sadly did so on foot, as their horses had all been eaten. So there you go again. Go through that, see what you think. Is any part of that is a crime, a horse crime? Just breaks my heart when I think of faithful horses doing everything that's asked of them, and in some ways you could say their final act was to provide food for their riders. Righto, end of the video. Many thanks. Share it if you would. Click subscribe or like. Oh, thank you very much. Until next time, cheers.